Also, hi, I'm Colleen Frank. I'm coming from WashU in St. Louis in the Department of Neurology. I'm at the Alzheimer's Center. So it's nice to meet all of you.
And what are you doing in New York?
Just visiting Laura.
Oh, you guys are friends?
We're-
From what?
Summer schools.
Oh,
Same
summer
time that
school.
we met at Cognitive Neuroscience Summer School, and then we
That's
saw
my favorite part of grad school.
Yeah.
Is-
brain campus,
Yeah.
and then we met again at the Neuro-Econ Summer School, and we were dorm mates.
Yeah.
Where
So-
did you guys do brain camp? Was it UCSB?
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
great. I loved it there.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, neat stuff.
We've got another class at you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Joe, did you
Yeah.
do brain camp too?
No.
Okay, so you want to assume that.
Okay, so we make risky decisions every day, things like, should I eat these leftovers from my fridge from 4 days ago? What route should I take home to avoid the worst of traffic? How much do I choose as a deductible on my new insurance? And so when I say risk, I mean it as a type of uncertainty that where the outcome is unknown, but the likelihood of each outcome is known, or it can at least be estimated. So for our risky choices, if we're deciding what route to take home, we might use our previous experiences to estimate the likelihood of a crowded subway car at, let's say, 5 p.m. on a Friday. We don't know the exact outcome, but we can at least estimate the chances. And so in my research, I look at risky decision-making using 2 lenses. So one of which is age. So here on this figure, you can see that the population is rapidly aging. There are more older adults than ever before, and this number will continue to grow. So this means that our leaders in government, business, healthcare, all of whom make very important decisions that affect all of us, are getting older. So it's important to understand how these people make decisions and how this changes across adulthood and into older age. The second domain that I've adopted is decision domain. That is, the people make a lot of important decisions across a number of different areas, right? So some choices are financial, like deciding how much to save for retirement. Others might be more social, like deciding who to marry or who to trust with your secrets. And others are more related to health, right? Deciding on a treatment for a medical condition or whether or not to get a vaccine. And so these decisions are not all equal. There's evidence that it's really hard to generalize between the different types of decisions. And so in my research program, I examine risky decision-making using a combination of these lenses as I attempt to answer how do people make important financial, social, and health-related decisions across adulthood. So I have several lines of research that kind of are within this umbrella term. So if any of these sound interesting, you can find me at lunch or email me about them. But I'm going to talk just today about just one of them. It has more of a social aspect that I'd like to get some feedback on. I'm creating a new study that I could use some help on, some adding additional measures potentially. So in the lab, risky decision-making is usually studied via money. This is because it makes for the easy calculation of value. We can make the outcome of the choice real, right? And we can give people the money. And financial decisions are really important. But people also make really important medical decisions, but these are really hard to study in the laboratory setting. And medical decisions often elicit a great deal of emotion, right? The possible risks can include things like death, right? That's not really like anything else we can compare it to in a laboratory-based test for financial decision-making. So in this line of research, I'm looking at how do people make highly emotional eliciting decisions, specifically in the medical domain, and how does it change in later life? And so some researchers have classified these different types of decisions into 2 major categories, one of which that is affect-rich, that is, if they elicit a great deal of emotion, and the other is affect-poor, that is, which relatively speaking, don't elicit the same level of affect. These are kind of typical everyday financial decisions, the ones we typically study in the laboratory. And so to be able to directly compare these types of decisions, researchers needed a unique way to experimentally do so. So they came up with a paradigm I'm going to describe to you now. So participants are asked to imagine a scenario where they need to purchase a medication out of pocket, take it for exactly 1 week to completely cure a serious illness. So participants are shown possible side effects, and for each one, they're asked to imagine that they have to choose between 2 different medicines to treat the disease equally effectively. One of the medicines always causes the side effect to occur, and the other does not cause the side effect to occur. But the medicine that does not cause the side effect is more expensive. Classic. So participants then see a list of side effects, they rank them, they provide monetary values. So if they were choosing between 2 medicines, one with the side effect, one without, how much more money would they be willing to pay for the medicine without the side effect? And in economics, they call this number the willingness to pay value. And so for this example, this hypothetical participant said that they would be willing to pay $10 more for a medication that doesn't cause itching and $90 more for a medication that doesn't cause memory loss. So then participants go through a series of choices where they choose between two medicines that each cause a side effect with some probability. So in this case, medicine A, in 800 out of 1,000 cases, itching occurs. And in medicine B, 100 out of 1,000 cases, memory loss occurs. So which medication would you choose? What we can do is compare it to purely financial decisions, and we use those willingness to pay values that they provided earlier and insert them. So the decisions are structurally equivalent and economically equivalent as well. And then we can compare the decisions being made between the side effect choices and the purely monetary choices. And the idea is that someone who's willing to pay $90 more to avoid a side effect, then they should make a similar decision to avoid losing that $90, but that's not what we find at all. So in general, in the existing literature, they find that for affect-rich decisions, those are the medical ones, people tend to be more risk-averse compared to the affect-poor, those equal decisions. So that means that they're more likely to avoid risks. They also find that in the affect-rich condition, people make overall worse decisions. So this is on something we call decision quality. They choose the options that are lower decision quality based on the expected value of the outcome. And we also find preference reversals. So in affect-poor decision, they might choose one option, but then for the matching decision in the affect-rich or affect-poor condition, they choose the other option. So together, these kind of systematic differences that we've seen time and time again, at least in 5 or 6 different studies, we call these the affect gap in risky choice. Now, a question that remains is, what about older adults? Older adults make highly consequential decisions. They include choices related to retirement, the management of investments and savings, as well as regarding the maintenance of medical conditions that tend to increase as you get older and in later life. So we also know that cognitive processing is seen to decline over the lifespan, right? Memory is the big one that we think tends to decline over the lifespan, but affective processing actually remains stable or even improves in older age. So this might mean that the affect gap might be more, less, or similarly pronounced. We really didn't have any idea about what direction it could go. So I'm going to skip over the behavioral results because I'd like to get to the modeling part. But in summary, we see the affect gap in risky choice is very similar in older adults. So older adults also show that lower decision quality and more risk aversion for the affect-rich decisions. What we don't know is how people are making these decisions. So one way we can look at how people are making decisions are using computational models. Who here is very familiar with computational models? Okay. And then some are not. So I'm just going to go over a brief refresher because I used to be the person who would zone out when someone would say computational model. And I try to avoid that. So at a broader scale, what we're doing in a computational model, right, is we take an environment, in this case, our choice problem that participants see, and then we can look at the outcome, the choice that someone actually makes. And what we're trying to do with a computational model is figure out the process. That is, what is going on here, right? And this is where our model comes in. This is the estimate of what is going on during this process that we can then test to see if our model predicts behavior. And so the model that I'm going to use is called Cumulative Prospect Theory, and it's an adaptation of traditional economic theories. So traditional theories take the value and the probability of each outcome. They use it to calculate the utility of each option. That's the satisfaction or the benefit that you get, right? How good an option is. And then we can transform it into choice probabilities so we can predict, what choices people are going to make. The problem with this is that in the real world, people don't always choose the option that quote unquote maximizes their utility, right? So cumulative prospect theory was created to more accurately reflect how people make decisions. And instead of using value and probability, they use things like subjective value and what we call subjective probability, also called weighted probability, but I think it's easier to call it subjective probability. So one of the primary uses of computational models is that we can estimate values of latent variables. These are the ones that are not directly observed, but they're inferred from other variables that are measured. And so for CPT, we can estimate several parameters, but the one I'm going to talk to you about today is called sensitivity. And this involves characterizing how well the objective and subjective values and probabilities match up. So the first one is called outcome sensitivity. And essentially, what outcome sensitivity is, how well does objective and subjective value match up? So if they matched up perfectly, it would be that diagonal line. But that's not normally what would happen. So normally it's more like the green line, and that's our outcome sensitivity here. What it's doing is characterizing how much more is $100 valued more or less than its actual value, and if so, how much more or how much less. So if we take a look at the results, again, we're comparing a group of younger adults to a group of older adults, doing our affect-rich and affect-poor decisions. So we're mapping outcome sensitivity. The diagonal line again represents if they were mapped up perfectly. We only include half of our function here because we only had negative outcomes, so these are the absolute values. The big bold and the big blue and the big bold red lines are those kind of group level means, and the individual lines are individuals. So it's hard to see, so I'm just going to fill in the area, but it's just for visualization. It's not an area under the curve analysis. So if we overlay the two, we can see that these two are not the same. The red line is higher than the blue. So for younger adults, they may value something like $40 as one thing, but the corresponding side effects, they value it even higher. Now, when we look at older adults, this was not the case. So if we color in that area again and we overlay it, you can see that for older adults, the red fits almost perfectly inside that blue. And this is indicating that older adults have equal outcome sensitivity for the two conditions. So in sum, we're seeing how a difference in how objective and subjective values are mapping onto one another between affect-rich and affect-poor, but only in younger ones. So the other type of sensitivity is probability sensitivity. This is how well the objective and subjective probability map onto one another. Diagonal line again represents if they were perfectly mapped, where 10% is always treated like 10% of the time. But that's not what's typical. What's typical is what we see closer to this pink line, which is an inverse S shape. So people tend to overweight small probabilities. They act as though 10% is a much larger percentage than it is. And they overweight large probabilities where they act like 80% is less than it is. So if we look at this in our participants, younger and older adults, if we fill in, we can see that in both age groups and in both conditions, we see that inverse S shape. But for the affect poor condition in blue, they treat 20% more like 60% of the time. But in the affect rich condition, actually they're treating 20% as more like 80% of the time. So if I say you're going to get, have memory loss 20% of the time, they're actually treating it more like I said 80% of the time, which is obviously not what we said, right? So if we overlay them, we can see that this difference is pretty consistent between the two conditions, and that it's consistent between the age groups. So we do see that older and younger adults show reduced probability sensitivity in the affect-rich condition. So we see overall in this general study, older adults don't value outcomes between affect-rich and affect-poor decisions as differently as younger adults, but their behavior actually looks really similar. But a more recent question that we've been having is how this might change when you're making decisions for another person. We're not always in charge of our own medical decisions, especially as we get older. We often have a surrogate, right, or someone, a power of attorney. So I'm interested in what that affect gap looks like for decisions for others. So there's one study that examined a similar question with this paradigm, and they found a similar size affect gap. But this paradigm was done only for students, and they were all younger adults, and it was designed to make a decision for your fellow classmate. And then also it was only tested for distant others, right? An unknown anonymous classmate, not loved ones. And they were coming in at it from the angle of like, how do physicians make decisions for people they don't necessarily know? But I'm also really interested in who will be, your loved one, right? The people who might actually be making those critical decisions for you. So I created a new paradigm where we kind of adapted this other one that includes a distant other, but to make it so that we can use the task across the lifespan. They're not a classmate, they're an acquaintance, like a neighbor you don't know well. They're told they should be someone you may say hello to in passing, but you don't regularly spend time with. Someone like the blonde woman across the hall with a small dog. This is very similar to what we find in our pilot study of what people actually say. You don't have to know their name, that's fine. And then we also added a loved ones condition. So here at close others, people are instructed to think of someone that they're close to, friend, sibling, partner, should be someone you regularly spend time with. As an example, my best friend, Rachel. And their participants either do the self condition or a distant other or close other. So it is between subjects, mainly because we cannot think of a way to not have carryover effects between making these decisions for different types of people. So I'm going to skip over just these basic results because they're boring, but kind of in a good way. We find that the affect gap exists for all three of these conditions. That is lower decision quality and higher risk aversion for the affect-rich decisions. But we don't find any interactions with the condition. So we don't find any differences in the affect gap between who you're making the decision for. We just find the affect gap. What we do see is that when we look at willingness to pay values, so again, this is the answer to the question, how much more are you willing to pay for a medication without side effects? What you can see here is that there wasn't a significant difference between self and distant other. And I will note that the decision or how much you're willing to pay for a close other and distant other is actually with their credit card. So it's not you're not paying for them, it's you have their credit card and you're deciding, basically the vignette is that you took their credit card and they're not answering their phone. They ask you to run errands for them because they're really sick with this disease, right? And so they're paying with their credit card. So they would be willing to pay slightly less money, but it's not significant. However, when it's close others, we see a significant difference that people reporting being willing to pay much more money with their close others credit card than when the medication is for their loved one compared to their self, which isn't surprising. But I think it does kind of highlight that this decision for close others might be particularly important to study in greater detail. So now that we know that our task works, our kind of adaptation works, we're particularly interested in how this close other relationship might change as it across adulthood. So later this month, we're looking at we're looking to collect 450 participants across the adult lifespan from 25 to 85 using online data collection. We want to include a few questionnaires, so I'm really interested to hear what we should potentially ask. We're also really interested in this kind of middle-age group because they have that, they're kind of that sandwich generation, right, where they often have to be caregivers for their children, but also for their parents at the same time, where they might actually have unique behaviors. And so I'm interested to hear kind of your general suggestions. When you were talking about psychopathy, I thought that was really interesting. Maybe we add a general, a scale like that. But yeah, interested to hear thoughts. And then longer term goals, I'm at WashU's Alzheimer's Center. So I'm really excited to kind of bring this work even more out of the lab to study real world health behaviors. So one decision that I'm in a good position to study is your decision to enroll in a clinical trial. So the current drugs have serious adverse reactions. Some of them are pretty dangerous, but they have somewhat potential. I don't know, it's hard to say at this point, but I think it makes for a really interesting group to study. I also have access to some really interesting groups, so including the first two that are almost guaranteed to get Alzheimer's. So these are people who are for sure going to get Alzheimer's, and they know that they are, at least in some cases. So that's extremely unique, and it provides this opportunity to better understand these decisions. So you can feel free to ask me more about these groups later, because they're very, very interesting. But with that, I would like to thank my collaborators and previous PIs, funding sources, and all of you for listening.
Okay, good time for a few questions. Let's also see the online people.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay.
We have a question online?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I'm guessing you're talking about me.
Yes,
Should I go
sorry.
ahead? Okay, awesome. So my name is Yahya. I wasn't here for the introduction. Yahya Al-Shami, postdoc at NYU in the Department of Economics. I thought this was a really great presentation, but I was wondering to what extent you think trust plays a role in the risk aversion, because sometimes what appears as risk aversion might be to an extent related to trust in medical institutions. So for example, you may be unwilling to take a drug with a particular probability for a side effect, not because you're risk averse, but because you don't trust that these statistics or these claims, when made by medical institutions, are accurate. And trust in medical institutions is variable across different contexts. So in Spain, for example, there is much higher trust than in most of Latin America or maybe even the Middle East. And there's also variability among different demographics in a single context like the United States, for example. So I think asking questions about trust in medical institutions, given this particular experiment, would be very interesting and enlightening. And I'd love to hear your reaction to that.
I agree. I think that would be really interesting, especially since we typically use US participants just because of the way of our paradigm works. We have to choose one particular currency at least. I think there would be a huge discrepancy, right, or variability in people's trust for medical institutions. And I think rightfully so. We're also not, when we're actually making these decisions, when you're told, about a new medication or a vaccine, right, the information is not presented in this way. So I think this is kind of a good start to kind of a little teaser on how we're making these real world decisions, but I don't at all think that is how we're making real world decisions. So I think that's one of the reasons that I'm trying to kind of bridge this gap where we're taking kind of more ecological valid, but also still really well controlled. But I think that is something that we could look at, just even a simple question about rate your trust in medical institutions or about, scientific findings in general.
Laura?
I had a question about the study where you're asking about the blonde woman down the hall.
Yes.
The close versus distant others. So one thing Jay and I have been talking about a lot is this notion of like intergroup bias in terms of intergenerational bias. Did you assess whether they were older? I mean, in this case, I assume it was a student sample, right? So whether it was like
Yes, so they had to be within 10 years. That was the other thing, and they also had to be above 18. The other thing is that for close others, you do not share financial resources.
right.
That I think we are going to have to change or at least control for, because that's a really tough group. Is like if we're studying older adults, the person closest to them who they're going to make a decision is their spouse. It was a little easier for 21-year-olds at college that most of them were kind of single and they could choose someone that wasn't financially intertwined with them. But I think we want the more realistic answer, right? Is if it's going to be their spouse that are making these decisions, we want to incorporate that. So I think for this next iteration, we are just going to ask a question about who it is and do you share financial resources. The reason we didn't want, so because we're interested in age effects, we need to keep them consistent first. So
Right.
it has to be a same age acquaintance or approximately within 10 or so years. That's what we said. And then in the future, I think we can look at, what if you're making a decision for a younger adult when you're older, or someone who's in their 20s or 30s making a decision for someone who's older. But I think for this first part, we're keeping it sort of consistent. Yeah.
It would be really interesting to see with I don't know about the preclinical sample and the Down syndrome sample, but I imagine maybe that one is a more longitudinal study. So maybe some of those decisions are an older person making the decision.
Yeah, so for the dominantly inherited Alzheimer's, actually, it's a very early onset Alzheimer's, so it can happen anywhere from their 20s to 50s. So these are groups that have a parent that have this really rare genetic mutation where they know if they have the gene, the breakthrough rate is, about 95% or at least. So if you have the gene, you pretty much have it. There's one person in the US alive right now that has the mutation who didn't get Alzheimer's. So we're looking at him in great depth. But I think that's a really interesting where you've seen someone go through it and you have this, so you're kind of really in this space where that this is the potential outcome, you might be more likely. For the Down syndrome group, which is really interesting, they all have study partners that bring them because of their intellectual disabilities. So we have kind of a built-in caretaker that is helping them make these decisions. So I think that would also be interesting just to kind of ask them versus, what is the decision that you would make versus your partner or your, study partner or, life partner. And then how that changes, especially as the disease might kind of continue, right? As you start to lose a little bit more of your cognition, and also some of your autonomy.
I was wondering about the difference between close other and self. Like they were willing to give more money for close other and self. That struck me as pretty surprising.
Well, it's not their money.
Okay, but
So that-
whose money is it again?
So the idea is that it would be you have their credit card or it's your money. So for the self, it is your money. And then the close other, it's not.
So you're using the close other's credit card for them?
Yes.
And the distant other, you're using the distant other's
Yes.
credit card for them? But still, why do you think it's so high for close others? Like you think you care about the not having side effects for your close other friend, your best friend or whatever, but you're also willing to blow through their money.
You don't seem to care about it. I think that we also do have affective ratings about like how would you feel if they experienced this side effect, and we're not seeing a huge difference, which I thought that would kind of map onto this. We're like, okay, you think if your loved one experiences hallucinations after getting a medication, right? Maybe you expect to feel really horrible compared to if you had that. But that's not really the case. It was pretty similar to about the self. So I think that's something that we really are interested in is like, well, why are the close others? Is it just so extreme? And then also we can look at how are they, the sensitivity to probability information. Are they acting like 20% is more like 90%? Are they kind of freaking out or are they just ignoring the probability? That's another aspect is that they might just be ignoring the probability information completely, right? Probability neglect, it's too overwhelming. They say hallucinations and they say I'm out, right? So I think that's also kind
for
of,
the close other, but not for the self as much.
Right.
It's like, so it's weird that there'd be like a probability neglect for one category of the three.
yeah.
I
But But I'm wondering if it's something about the emotional arousal that comes when you're thinking about your loved one.
You don't wanna watch your loved one suffer, but you
Right.
also don't think that your loved one places the same value on a dollar that you do for yourself or something like that.
Yeah,
There's some weird asymmetry going on about presumably, your empathy for their suffering, but not for their economic well-being or something.
right.
Yeah, maybe I was gonna say, maybe it's also to do with just you, the emotional labor that comes with you accompanying them through this. Versus when you have it
They're not
yourself,
gonna
like-
complain if they're tight for cash, but they're gonna like
Yeah.
complain if they're going through side
Well,
effects,
not
and
even
that's
that.
gonna be.
Not even that, but seeing them experience hallucinations is probably more painful.
Yeah.
Like maybe there's more of a compensatory mechanism at play where you feel like money you can replenish.
But you only think that for them, not for yourself,
Yeah,
because
like
you're not
going
willing to spend that much
through it,
money
so
yourself.
if you're hallucinating, like, it's, you know.
No,
It's
but
only 1 week of hallucinations.
Yeah, but normally what you get is like hallucinations would suck for me. I would hate for my best friend to go through that. But here you're not seeing like
But
an
I think
analogy.
there is something about medical decisions where you as a caregiver are more emotionally involved, like the emotional valence is actually higher than for your
You know,
own.
clearly, yeah, no, I'm just saying that's like an interesting, it seems
Yeah.
anomalous to me.
That feels like that tracks with like, I would be more likely to call an ambulance for somebody, like a close other that I felt needed it, than even if I was in their same level of
Yeah.
pain, I wouldn't want that.
As long as they were gonna cover it with their credit card.
Well, that's also interesting, that's like, you
Yeah.
need to be able to, I wanna control for that, it's like,
Yeah.
if you have to spend $5,000 on an ambulance, right? If
Yeah.
it's your shared income, I think that might be interesting,
Yeah.
is like, is this effect still gonna happen? And then we do have measures of how close they see themselves, right, with the circles. But I wanna add in a measure of empathy, if anyone has any suggestions of what measure to include, that's not my area of expertise. But yeah, other things that you might think just influence this that I could add into the surveys.
Okay,
I
Remy?
was just thinking kind of the same thing. For example, you might agree that it's the right thing to do to spend money, for example, for your health. But you don't want to spend that money because you're gonna have maybe an aversive reaction to losing that money, or an embarrassment for calling the ambulance. But if it's for your friend, then you don't care about their feeling, care about their health maybe a little more. So you're gonna be doing the right thing even though they might feel this embarrassment.
Do you think it's possible there's any like sense of guilt that's trying to be avoided for not spending the most on your close other? Like they'll be mad at you if you didn't get them the best drug or something?
I mean, I think that's possible, right? It's like, well, if how are they gonna feel basically if you opted to get them a different medication, right? If you said, well, let's just go with the cheap one, and if they get memory loss, it's fine, right? I think that's definitely something, and I think we need to know a little bit more about, especially when we're making this decision for others, is like, what are their thought processes? So maybe I add some like qualitative, just, get a sense of that, so that we can then create some measures to better understand the decisions that they're making. It's a really good idea.
Could it maybe be like, I can handle these side effects, but I'm not sure if my other friend can handle it? Like my friend might be like, more sensitive, basically.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely a consideration, is like, I'm fine, right? I can handle this, but
Yeah.
I don't wanna put them through that if it's my decision, right?
I remember there's a study by Molly Crockett, I don't know.
I know.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
one on electric shots.
Yeah.
It wasn't that her explanation that uncertainty about others' mental states is what drove this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I think is really interesting
Yeah.
about that, yeah.
Okay, one last question?
Yeah, last question.
Alright.
All right, I thought that reputational mechanisms might really matter to explain the discrepancy between the two, because with the close other, your reputation matters. There's a sticky reputation. This is probably a selfish, economistic way of interpreting it, but it does matter in the sense that you'd like to appear generous. And so making that decision like, oh, money doesn't matter that much, right? Health is a priority. That's perhaps, provides this good reputation in a way that doesn't matter with a distant other, where your reputation is not going to be sticky or unlikely to see that person many more times. So this desire to present oneself as generous, or maybe giving, not caring that much about money, even though you're not really using your own money, but you'd like to appear like money doesn't matter that much to me, health is a priority, etc. That might play a role.
Yeah, I'm wondering what's the best way to measure that, how much someone cares about their reputation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.